Well, hello to everyone watching at Warwick Rose City, Goondiwindi and here in Stanthorpe, and anyone else who might be watching us through YouTube. Look, imagine it's World War II, April 1945. The Russians are at the gates of Berlin. Most of the city has been razed, totally flattened by the Yanks bombing by day, the British bombing by night, and on top of that, Russian artillery now rains down. Imagine you're a German civilian in Berlin and you're absolutely petrified. Stories of Russian atrocities run rife, stories of civilians captured, raped and murdered. The end is near. The fatherland has collapsed. You've spent months huddling in an underground bunker. 12,000 people, that's 3 people per square metre. Highly unsocial distancing. Candles are lit to warn when the oxygen's low, the water mains are destroyed, the toilets blocked, not just by sewerage, but by the bodies of those who can't take it anymore. Death is everywhere. And any day now the Russians will arrive and that will be the end. History records the atrocious conditions endured by Germans in the closing days of World War II. To cope, heavy drinking and debauchery became common. What would you do in this situation, knowing death was crouching at your door with only days, hours, maybe minutes to live? What would you do? Well, that's the situation in Daniel chapter 5. The Mede and Persian armies stand poised to capture Babylon. The enemy is at the gates. Here we have an inside view of how the Babylonian king chose to face such disaster. Before we unpack this chapter though, we need some background information. Firstly, Belshazzar calls Nebuchadnezzar father, but he's not his immediate ancestor. Neb died about 24 years earlier. There's been a series of kings, many assassinated by family members or court conspirators. So when Belshazzar calls Neb father, he just means ancestor and earlier king. Secondly, Belshazzar is called king, but is more a co-regent, ruling on behalf of his father called Nabonidus, who's away fighting the Persians. This explains why in verse 7 he can only offer the third highest position in the empire, because he's actually only second in command. Thirdly, don't confuse Belshazzar with Daniel, who was called Belteshazzar. So in the previous chapter, chapter 4, we had the high point of the Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar, but now fast forward 43 years to chapter 5. The year is now 539 BC, with a weak king in Belshazzar, and Babylon's on its knees. Let's dive in. In verses 1 to 4, Belshazzar's thrown quite a party. It's a royal banquet. There's thousands of nobles, not just his wives, but concubines as well. The women kept for his indulgence. There's heavy drinking and debauchery. Why? Because the Persian army's about to capture Babylon. Death is at the door, and just like those Germans in Berlin, with nothing else to lose, what does Belshazzar do? He throws a huge party. Petrified, they too are hitting the bottle and escaping from reality in the arms of strangers. But they also pray to their gods. They say there are no atheists in foxholes. And I want to ask, is this really any different to what people might do today? What about you? If you had death knocking on your door with just days, hours, maybe minutes to live. Well, in verses 3 and 4, Belshazzar then calls for the goblets taken from the Jewish temple by Nebuchadnezzar. He wants to toast the gods of Babylon, pray to the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood and stone. He really is covering his bases, praying to all of these Babylonian gods and thumbing his nose at the God of Israel. But he's also making one last show of bravado. a power play, a piece of propaganda showing everyone that King Neb's trophies are nothing but wine goblets to him. He's ingratiating himself with his gods, making one final throw of the dice. If Neb's gods allowed him to conquer the Israelites, maybe they'll allow me to fend off the Persians. But when we compare the two kings, Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar, they're like chalk and cheese, aren't they? Here Belshazzar, at the end of his reign, exalts the Babylonian gods, whereas Nebuchadnezzar ended his reign exalting the one true God. King Neb, remember, said at the end of chapter 4, starting at verse 37, "Now I praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble." This young, arrogant Belshazzar has failed to learn the lessons of his own family history. And then in verses 5 to 9, we see the mysterious writing on the wall. The party's interrupted. This wasn't on the program. And the hand of God writes on the wall. Belshazzar is petrified. His knees knock so badly, his legs give way, and he soils his pants in fear. Belshazzar knows deep down this writing on the wall isn't some innocuous piece of graffiti, and he senses doom. He needs to know what it says. But despite the offer of an incredible reward, no one can read it. And once again, the impotence of the Babylonian wise men is exposed. And Belshazzar goes as pale as a ghost. In verses 10 to 15, the queen enters the scene to give some advice. She's likely Belshazzar's mother, hence her brazen address to the king and the fact she wasn't there with his drinking mates and mistresses. But why wasn't Daniel there with all the other wise men? Perhaps the king didn't want him there, or perhaps it's simply his age. By now, Daniel's about 85 years old. He's either been sidelined by all the court shenanigans, made redundant, or maybe been retired. And now in verses 13 to 24, Daniel, he responds. Belshazzar asks, "Are you, Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah?" It seems they hadn't met. In verses 13 to 24, Daniel responds like a prophet, like he did with King Nebuchadnezzar in verse 17. Daniel refuses the reward offered by King Neb's descendant. Notice how secure, defined, and differentiated Daniel is. You can keep your trinkets, thanks. Notice Daniel gives him a short history lesson before dealing with God's graffiti. As great as a king as Nebuchadnezzar was, Daniel says it was God who gave him his empire. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar's last recorded words were praising, honouring and glorifying Daniel's God as the one true God who lives forever. He'd humbled himself and been lifted up. In contrast, listen to Daniel's assessment of this wannabe king in verses 22 to 23. "But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, and of bronze, iron, wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand, but you did not honour the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways." Belshazzar has not humbled himself, but instead set himself up against God. Belshazzar hasn't learnt the lessons of history. This chapter began with what Nebuchadnezzar took, the vessels from the temple, and now we're confronted with what Big Neb has been given. As Belshazzar sits there, cup in hand, he's reminded of who gave them into Neb's hand in the first place. King Neb had been smart, He'd seen the writing on the wall. He recognised the sovereignty of God over his kingdom and his life. He repented of his sin. Remember last week? God removed his authority. He was like a beast in the wilderness. But remember what he did before God restored him? Neb raised his eyes towards heaven. But with Belshazzar, he's like a deer in the headlights. He says and does nothing. So in verses 25 to 28, Daniel hands down God's verdict. Mene, mene, tekel parsin. Mene means measure. God has measured your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel means weight. You have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Parsin, or the singular Perez, means division. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. It's a message of judgment. It's a message of death. For the young king with a budding appetite for judging others, God judges. In verses 29 to 31, we see gifts and the collapse of the kingdom. Belshazzar rewards Daniel, but he's not third in charge for long, because that very night Babylon falls to the invading Medes and Persians, and Belshazzar is slain. In fact, according to the famous Greek historian Xenophon, it was precisely because of Belshazzar's party that the Persians chose to attack that night. When faced with God's judgment, there's a vast difference between King Neb and Belshazzar, isn't there? Neb repents in the face of God's judgment. Bel doesn't. So I guess, what about you? Do you believe in the one true God or not? How are you going to respond to God's judgment over your life? You see, the writing's on the wall. God has measured your kingdom and it will come to an end. God has weighed your deeds and they've been found wanting. There's a division and it's between you and God. So how will you respond? You know, the big question in life, the question we all want answered is, what are we here for? What does my life mean? Surely we don't live this life and die and that's it. Surely there has to be more to life than that. There's got to be more to it. The Bible tells us that death is the punishment for sin. And you know, our society pretty much soils its pants trying to deal with that. Deep down, we're terrified about death. Look at how people behave responding to COVID, fighting in the supermarket over toilet rolls. Look at all the nice ways we describe death, passing away, kicking the bucket, pushing up daisies. There are so many ways we avoid thinking about it. Yet really our fear of death drives much of what we do in life. How terrifying it must be to know you are about to meet your Maker and have no hope. How do you live like that? How do you die like that? Sometimes I think back to my old life before I was saved, and I realise that I lived my life trying very, very hard to just not think about it. There's all sorts of ways we self-soothe to avoid the real issues in our lives. For some of us, it's food. For some, alcohol. For some, other addictions. Maybe you lose yourself on screens or binge watching Netflix. Or maybe you're taking your pain out on your partner. One step towards justifying an affair, the excitement of a new relationship, avoiding the deep character work needed to keep intimacy alive in your marriage. Or maybe you toast your own greatness, one highly respected in town. We immerse ourselves in distractions and escape reality to fool ourselves that we're okay. Like Belshazzar, praising the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, we must see them for what they truly are. Lifeless lumps of earthly material, wholly impotent in the spiritual realm. Well, a wise disciple is one who knows it's God who has his kingdom. his very life in his hands. How can we live like that as wise disciples? Well, take a minute. Write down the top 3 ways of ignoring death and pain in your own life. What's one behaviour you could put to death this week? What's one new God-honouring habit you could start? The fear of death, it stalks all of us. No one cheats death. So what's the point of life? Do we really just live, then die, and that's it? Is there any real hope? Well, I want to tell you today, yes, there is. You see, the whole theme of the book of Daniel is that despite our fears, in our apparent circumstances, God is in control. This is one of the hardest things to do, I think, in our Christian walk. Submitting our lives, our control, our suffering, and our success to God. We can be like Belshazzar, wrapping our hands around goblets and sculling wine, praising false gods, deadening the pain of our sin, ignoring the writing on our wall. Or we can lift our eyes to God and see it's God who holds our life and kingdom in his hands. God judges. The writing is on the wall. Our days are numbered. We will be measured. We will be weighed. But God brings life to the dead by opening his hands to nails on a cross. The fingers that wrote on that wall are flung wide and pierced on a crucifix. It wasn't only nails beaten that day. As nails were beaten into those hands, death was beaten too.